Hey everyone, let's talk a little bit about equilibrium and the efficiency of markets and how we can see that trade can be mutually beneficial and how we can look for those gains to society. So to start with, we talked about demand, and now I want to highlight that demand is based on people's willingness to pay. That's WTP, that is not a typo. And that's based on people's marginal benefit or their perceived marginal benefit from something. So if you're thinking about pizza, right, if we're looking at the demand for pizza, basically at high prices, people will buy fewer slices or fewer pies, and at lower prices, people will buy more, right? That's just the law of demand. But what we didn't say initially when we introduced demand is that these individual units are purchased by individual people who have different expectations about the marginal benefit of a slice of pizza to them, and therefore their willingness to pay for that pizza. So the demand curve is really, I'm going to use a different color to highlight that. This is really based on marginal benefit and reflects people's willingness to pay. So somebody who really, really loves pizza, maybe this is Al, he would buy a slice at a really high price. And if you lowered the price, Al is still in, but somewhere down here you pick up Bob as well. And then somewhere in here, Carla and Dee, right? They're interested in pizza as well, but Dee doesn't value it, right? She's not willing to pay the same prices as Carla or Bob or Al. So the demand curve really reflects people's willingness to pay, the benefit they expect to get from the pizza. All right, now, what about on the supply side? Supply is based on the marginal opportunity cost of bringing that good to the market. Right? So if we are thinking about our supply curve, our upward sloping supply curve, there are some people who would bring the good to market, bring some units of it to market for a very low price. And there are other people in here who would, and let's say we're still talking about pizza. Could I be on the demand curve for pizza? Sure. But as it is, my comparative advantage, like what I seem to be best at doing is something other than making pizza. But you could lure me into the pizza market, right? Up here, if slices of pizza were selling for $30 each, right, in today's world and today's prices, I might say, yeah, I'll make pizzas. So, right, there are people who are willing to supply pizzas at different prices. This is really based on the marginal opportunity cost of bringing those goods to market. People who have a lower opportunity cost of producing that thing will supply it down here, and people with a higher opportunity cost would only be lured into the market at much higher prices. So what happens then when we put it all together? So I have here, yep, hold on, let's put it all together here. Here's our demand, right, which we also said is based on marginal benefit, which reflects their willingness to pay. Now, here's where we get into the good stuff. There's their equilibrium in the market, right? The point where the supply and demand curve cross, where the quantity demanded right off the demand curve is equal to the quantity supplied, which you read off the supply curve. Now, we had some people on our demand curve here. We had Al and Bob and Carla and Dee. Here's Effie and Frank and George and Harry, right? So there are other people on here. Now, do Effie and Frank and George and Harry, do they buy pizzas? No, right? Because the equilibrium price is higher than the marginal benefit or the willingness to pay, so they don't buy pizzas. But do these people, what do we say, Al, Bob, Carla, Dee, Effie, right? They buy pizza. And even though Al was willing to pay this high price, what does he actually pay? He pays the market equilibrium price. And so Al, who was willing to pay this price and only has to pay that price, is made better off by the distance of the pink arrow. right? And Bob didn't value the pizza as highly as Al did, but he still values it at more than the equilibrium price. Same with Carla, same with Dee, same with Effie, right? So for everybody on the demand curve above the equilibrium price, they're made better off when they pay P sub B, the market clearing equilibrium price, for something that they valued at an amount greater than that. And so this whole area under the demand curve and down to the equilibrium price, we call this consumer surplus. Now, I didn't name this. I realized that just recently we talked about how when the price is higher, the price in the market is higher than the market clearing equilibrium price, the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded, and that resulted in a surplus. That's a different use of the word surplus. Let me just apologize in advance on behalf of whoever, used the same word in different ways, but all of you are English speakers, right? So you're familiar with this idea that we use the same word in different ways in different contexts. So that is the case here. So you just have to understand that consumer surplus is different than the surplus that we talked about before. So consumer surplus is everything below the demand curve and above the equilibrium price. And it represents gains to consumers who value the good at more than what they have to pay for it. Now, let's think about the producers. So you had already used purple, didn't I? How about brown? That's boring, but it'll work. So you had producers, right, who would bring the goods to market at these prices that are less than the equilibrium price. You also, right here, I said I would make pizzas at $30 a slice, but the equilibrium price is much, much, much lower than that, so I never get sort of drawn into the making of pizzas. But for all these people who do, Zed and, I don't know, what's a name that starts with Y? I'm totally blanking. Or Xavier, or like other people we could name here on the supply curve. They're willing to supply at this price, and they get to sell it for that price. So does that make them happy? Yes, absolutely, right? Are they made better off if their marginal opportunity cost of producing it is on the supply curve and they actually get to sell it at that market clearing equilibrium price? Yes. And so that represents gains to the producers, or as we're going to call it, producer surplus. So producer surplus is this area below the equilibrium price and all the way down to the supply curve. So there you go. Whenever, just in chapter 1 or 2, when we said voluntary exchange is mutually beneficial, right? And that's why the cashier and the customer both say thank you, right? The seller and the buyer are happy. Well, here now we have a graph, the supply and demand graph, the model, to try to illustrate that. We can measure the actual gains, the surplus to each party. So consumer surplus, right? The difference between what the consumer was willing to pay and what they actually have to pay. Right? The difference, super abbreviated here, between the willingness to pay and the equilibrium price, what they were willing to pay and what they actually had to pay, right? That is, it's the area under the demand curve and above the equilibrium price. And the producer surplus, that's the difference between the equilibrium price and the supply curve. All right, the price they could, let's see, we call that the opportunity cost of bringing it to market. Marginal opportunity cost. So it's the area above supply and below the equilibrium price. And so when you put it all together, you get the picture that we just had, that this is a neater version of what I just showed you, but consumer surplus under the demand curve down to the equilibrium price, producer surplus above the supply curve up to the equilibrium price. Because of this, we say markets are efficient. That is, at equilibrium, you maximize the sum of consumer surplus and producer surplus. At any other price, you will end up with less surplus than you do there. And incidentally, consumer surplus plus producer surplus. More generally, we just call it economic surplus. Right, so economic surplus is equal to consumer surplus plus producer surplus. So basically, you maximize the area of consumer surplus. The economists don't care as much about who gets it. Does it benefit the consumers? Does it benefit the producers? As they do about the fact that it exists, right? That there is this benefit there. So that's the deal. Markets are efficient. We achieve what we're ultimately going to call allocative efficiency by turning resources into this final good or service, whatever market we're talking about, pizza, pressure sprayers, earbuds, whatever it is. We take resources and we turn them into the final good. And as long as the benefit to the consumer for that last unit, let's pick a brighter color. As long as the benefit to the consumer for that last unit is greater than or equal to the marginal opportunity cost of getting it there, and then we stop. Whenever the resources would cost this much to make something that the consumers value here, we don't do it. Right? We stop because that would be inefficient, right? To take resources that have an opportunity cost equal to this upper pink dot and to turn them into something that consumers only value at that lower pink dot, that would be a problem, right? That would make society worse off. So there you go. That's where I want to stop here. Markets are efficient. We're going to pick up with this in Chapter 5. We'll talk more about sort of welfare economics and how society is better off. But at this point, we want to stop with the idea of economic surplus, consumer and producer surplus, and the idea that at equilibrium, if the market is functioning well, we'll maximize that area.